Let's review some key takeaways from this week's readings and videos related to early European colonization in Eastern North America. This week's course content is a little heavier on Europeans and their efforts to stake claims to lands held by Native Americans, but it is important to get a sense of the magnitude of the European migration, or, as some scholars say, invasion. Between 1000 CE and 1650 CE, Europe went through a number of major changes, including the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the Renaissance, all of which changed Europe. New views on society and economics emerged. Europeans developed new technology in navigation and shipbuilding. These changes led to increased exploration by numerous European powers. This was also a period in which Europe became increasingly outward-looking. The French became interested in the northern half of North America in part because they did not want to directly engage the Spanish and Portuguese, who focused on the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, and South America. Giovanni da Verrazzano was an Italian who explored for France and who looked for a legendary northwest passage around North America to India, leaving on a voyage in 1524. Europeans, I should note, at this time were convinced that there was another northern route to Asia, although successful commercial navigation through the Canadian Arctic archipelago did not occur until the 21st century. Jacques Cartier claimed what is present-day Canada for France. Cartier was the first European to describe and map the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River, beginning in 1534. Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, explored Nova Scotia and Cape Cod, among other places, for nearly 2 decades in the early 17th century. He later became an important French administrator, helping found many settlements and trading posts. English ship captain Henry Hudson led exploration for the Dutch in the early 1600s. He claimed the area along what we today call the Hudson River up to present-day Albany from Manhattan Island. The Dutch West India Company settled colonists on Manhattan Island and at Fort Orange. They also established trading colonies in the West Indies and for a period of time controlled much of present-day Brazil. John Cabot explored the region around Newfoundland in 1497. Queen Elizabeth I, as we talked in the reading, gave a grant of land to Sir Humphrey Gilbert in 1578. Those voyages were mostly failures. Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored voyages to the Virginia and Chesapeake Bay area. The French early on were active participants in the fur trade. They tried to colonize Florida in 1564, but were forced out by the Spanish. In 1603, Samuel de Champlain established what would become known as the colony of New France in modern-day Quebec at the center. New Netherland was established in 1614 by the Dutch. The Dutch West India Company was founded to carry out trade and set up colonies in order to entice Dutch settlers. They developed what is known as the patroonship system. This granted property rights to land in exchange for bringing new settlers to the colony. Trade and profits largely drove the Dutch, and they were less motivated by missionary goals than the French or the Spanish. There was a special relationship for a period of time in the 17th century between the Dutch and surrounding Native American groups, and generally the Dutch treated Native Americans as equals in business, if not in culture or in religion. The Dutch were fairly intolerant when it came to other faiths, but they were able to compartmentalize that and not let it interfere with profits, unlike the English Puritans, who had a degree of intolerance but that carried over into other spheres. Early on, the new arrivals from Europe had to contend with powerful native groups, and the most significant of these were the Iroquois. They were also known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They were centered in present-day New York, but they claimed territory extending beyond the Great Lakes region in the 17th century. In the 16th century, the Iroquois consisted of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and Seneca nations. The other groups would later join the Iroquois Confederacy. This was the largest and most successful of native confederacies in what today is the United States and Canada. In 1606, the Virginia Company of London and the Plymouth Company were given rights to colonize North America. The Virginia Company focused on present-day Virginia and Maryland and had much more of a commercial or profit-seeking focus. The Plymouth Company was centered in New England, and it had primarily a religious focus. They were predominantly Puritans, or at least influenced by Puritan teachings, the teachings of John Calvin, who insisted on purifying the Church of England. Those Puritans did. The Pilgrims were similar in philosophy to the Puritans, but wanted to separate completely from the mother country, which they saw as hopelessly corrupt by the Anglican Church. Among the voyages that Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored was one that we today call the Lost Colony of Roanoke. In 1585, the Raleigh expedition, sponsored by Raleigh, I should add, he didn't actually visit the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They established the Roanoke Island colony. In 1588, the colony was settled with 120 men, women, and children, and they arrived to make Roanoke Island colony their new home. 2 years passed, and in 1590 there was a resupply mission that showed no trace of the Roanoke colonists. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a tree, which at the time was the name of a nearby island. There's many theories as to what happened to them. They may have just died. They may have been swept away by a hurricane out to sea. They may have joined a Native American group in the region. We just don't know. There's also conspiracy theorists who've got other wacky ideas, including alien abduction, to explain the disappearance of the colonists. Let's next review European trade and missionary activities in eastern North America, both of which had significant influence on the history and culture of Native American groups in the eastern half of North America. As we mentioned earlier, Samuel de Champlain established New France, centered at Quebec, as a French fur trading outpost. This proved to be a rather inhospitable location, and it initially attracted very few settlers. As a result, the French developed a reliance on the Huron people that would later become a more formal military alliance against the Iroquois. The European market for fur helped spur what French settlement there was. There's 3 French terms related to North American demographics you should be aware of in this course from this particular module. The coureurs de bois, literally this means runners of the woods. There were these were independent French traders who traveled in New France in the interior of North America. Métis is a term similar to the Spanish word mestizo, meaning mixed blood, referring to the children of French and Native American parents. And la fille du roi literally means the king's daughters. This term refers to women and girls actively recruited by the French government in the 17th century, whose travel to New France was paid for by the king. This policy was promoted in order to increase the number of white women and thus the number of French families to increase. It wasn't really that successful of a plan. Only about 800 women were recruited to go, and you can imagine having to leave your home and family in France to go thousands of miles across the ocean to a frontier setting would not be very attractive for even with the inducements uh, paid for by the French crown. The Virginia Company was chartered in 1606, but it dissolved in 1624. It was created to profit from natural resources in North America, but it really found only one commodity it could exploit, which was land. English colonists pushed deeper into Native American territory, causing friction from Native American groups already living on these lands. The English developed a mixed economy, initially based on furs, timber, tobacco, and limited agriculture. But quickly, the English had a need for more labor. They moved from indentured servants to the headright system, in which colonists who paid for other immigrants to travel and settle were given land, typically 50 acres per person recruited to come over. And a number of English settlers became quite wealthy and had massive land holdings as a result of the headright system. Eventually, the English colonies began to make use of slavery to better meet their labor needs, at least in terms of labor demand, not quality of life for enslaved persons. This was especially true for labor-intensive crops like tobacco. William Penn received much of what is today the state of Pennsylvania as a grant from the English king. He was a Quaker, a member of a religious group that sought to restore Christianity to a simpler spirituality. Penn sought and cultivated good relationships with Native American groups and signed treaties with them. In particular, he had good relations with the Lenape, or the Delaware people. However, there were some negative long-term consequences to these policies. This ended up setting up rivalries between the Lenape and the Iroquois Confederacy. Also, Penn's sons, after he passed away, did not prove to be as interested in cultivating good relations, and they quickly went back on their word on some agreements and with Native Americans, and this really soured relationships with other Native American groups in the region, who began to distrust even more European promises and treaties. The Dutch Republic in this time period, and we're talking the 17th century here, was a very powerful force in the Atlantic world and really in world commerce. The Dutch West India Company complemented the Dutch East India Company in Asia. It was established in 1621 to help the Dutch profit from New World holdings. New Netherlands initially served as a fur trading outpost. They had a headquarters in New Amsterdam, and one of the highlights of their presence in the New York region was Fort Orange, which later became Albany. The fur trade brought the Dutch and native groups together, and the Dutch, more so than the French or the English, proved to be better able to compartmentalize business and religion, and they're able to put aside. And again, it's not necessarily that they considered Native Americans completely equal, but for the purposes of business, they were much less inclined to deal with religion than were the English or the French. The French put forth greater energy in their missionary efforts in North America than their English and Dutch counterparts. Jesuit missionaries in particular spread Catholicism to Native Americans. And we know a great deal about their activities because of a massive collection of documents that today is known as the Jesuit Relations. The last time I checked, it was available in 73 volumes, and each volume is considerably large. You can also find the Jesuit Relations in online versions if you're interested in doing research on this topic. These were reports from Jesuit missionaries to their superiors, updating them on the missionaries' progress in the conversion of Native American tribes. An example of the influence of the Jesuits can be found in the history of Kateri Tekakwitha, a Native American woman who eventually was canonized by the Catholic Church and made a saint in 2012, the first indigenous saint of the Americas. The Puritans were much less dedicated than the French in spreading Christianity to Native Americans. One of their few enterprises on the religious front was to urge Indians to live in what were known as praying towns under the supervision of the English, which not many Native Americans were inclined to do. The Puritans placed great emphasis on the centrality of the Bible. They did translate the Bible into the local Algonquian language. However, there were many tensions between natives and Puritans, who themselves were also quite intolerant of native religious beliefs. European ways increasingly disrupted native life, and the English engaged in a series of wars with Native Americans, or engaged in European wars that dragged Native Americans in as allies or enemies. We'll talk more about these later in the course. Generally speaking, the Native American groups of the eastern half of North America were polytheistic, meaning that they believed in more than one god. Many of these traditions talk of a great spirit who is responsible for the creation of humans, plants, and animals, and the universe. To various degrees, Native American religions were animistic. This is the idea that everything has a spiritual essence, perhaps not a soul, but a spiritual essence. To Native Americans, the spiritual world interacted with the physical world. Europeans typically placed demands on native populations to convert to Christianity, which of course added to conflict, especially if the groups didn't want to convert. Finally, let's talk briefly about Native Americans and plants. European expansion, as we talked about in the Columbian Exchange section, led to the movement of plants across the Atlantic. Indians possessed a vast understanding of New World plants, and they were potentially a very rich source of information. We discussed in the readings, for example, the medicinal properties of the peacock flower as one example. However, Europeans often did not trust local knowledge, and they failed to take full advantage of this indigenous wisdom. That's all for this review of Week 7 materials, and we'll see you next week.